Hello, I'm Perrin Beatty, and welcome to the Business of Business, which is a periodic program that we have to talk with senior business leaders in Canada about important issues facing the Canadian business community. We're very fortunate today to have Dawn Desjardins with us. Dawn is an economist and executive with experience in researching economic and policy issues. Now, over her career, she's communicated complex issues to clients, to decision makers, and to media audiences. She was RBC's deputy chief economist, a reporter for Bloomberg Financial News in Canada, and a bond strategist at JP Morgan Canada. So an incredible CV. At RBC, Dawn managed a team of economists who were responsible for the economic and financial market forecasts for Canada and the United States. She's a passionate advocate of women's labor market engagement. And in recent years, she's used her research to start conversations, drive policy discussions, and affect change. A great guest for us to have today. Dawn, welcome. We're delighted to have you with us.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Well, let's get started. Inevitably, when you're talking to an economist in Canada today, the first question relates to interest rates. And a poll that was released that was taken in July by Abacus Research demonstrated that when Canadians were asked, are higher interest rates essential to deal with inflation, there was an exact tie, with 41% saying yes, either definitely or probably, and 41% saying definitely not or probably not. What about the relationship between Bank of Canada interest rates and inflation?
Well, I think it's the only tool they really have. And I do think it is effective. Now, is it effective immediately? No. I mean, that's one of the things about monetary policy. We have, to quote central bankers, long and variable lags. So it can take a considerable amount of time before higher rates actually impact economic activity. So you kind of feel like you're in this period of time, rates have moved up, everyone's very nervous, but nothing seems to be happening. And I think in some ways that's where we are right now, with the first quarter growth in Canada being so strong and people really anticipating a slowing in economic activity. But I do think they are effective. And it's particularly important, I think, because when Canadians are thinking about where prices are going to go, I mean, we want, all of us want, whether we're someone in business, whether we're a consumer, to be able to count on prices, not ratcheting around wildly, not moving up significantly, not moving down. And I think, we've been through this period of time since the early 90s where we've been able to rely on inflation being relatively within a range. So I do think that, that is something that central banks will remain committed to. And I do think that because that is their one tool, they in fact have to use it. Now, how much do they use it? Well, I think right now the bank itself is kind of at a crossroads. In their most recent press conference, the governor said, he does not want to raise rates too much, over tighten essentially, and cause unnecessary harm or pain to Canadians. So that, I think, for central banks is kind of that's the tight, narrow road they're trying to walk. How do we slow the economy without really tipping it into a deep, dark recession? So it's very challenging.
Can I pick up on that point? To what extent is there a risk of the government overcorrecting, of the Bank of Canada putting its foot too much on the brakes? Because there's a lag effect here as well.
Exactly.
It isn't felt immediately. It could be felt 12 months from now.
Exactly. Yeah.
How worried are you that the Bank of Canada may have overcorrected?
Well, at this stage, I think, we've gone through a year where they've raised interest rates for 16 months, where they've raised interest rates significantly. 4.75 percentage points to get that rate to 5%. Now, we did see the immediate reaction in the housing market. In 2022, we did see home sales activity drop about 25%, and it has since come back a bit, kind of wobbly at the moment, but it certainly has come back. I think one of the big concerns is the fact that we do know that Canada has such an elevated level of household debt. And so it all, as you say, it takes time, it's lagged. So, the first people being impacted were people with variable rate mortgages and variable payments. Suddenly, oops, they're getting squeezed on their budgets. The next group is their variable rates, but they have a fixed payment. Now, suddenly they're not paying as much principal as they used to. They're paying all towards interest. So again, that just kind of sows seeds down the road. And then the rest of the mortgage holders, of course, are in fixed, and that's staggered over time. So I do think that will take effect on the economy and the consumer. And I think we're already seeing the consumer start to pull back a bit. We had lots of savings during the pandemic. We were quite itchy to get traveling, to go out to dinner, and Canadians have been doing that. So have they over tightened? I wouldn't say that. I mean, the jury's obviously still out if we see a huge recession. I'll rue my comments here, but I do think that, we're going to see a gradual pullback by the consumer. Businesses, of course, in that environment, also pulling back. So you will see slower economic activity. Now at Deloitte, our forecast calls for basically no growth in the second half of this year. And that's all of that lagged impact of those higher interest rates taking effect.
Well, and it's important for us to note that no growth is not a sign that the policy has failed. It may be a sign that the policy is working.
Exactly. And if we don't have, we've been kicking the idea of a recession down the road now for several quarters. Oh, the recession's coming, the recession's coming. And we do have, we have modest negatives, but really I would say if we get through this with very small negatives or, zero growth, that would be a big win. That would be that long sought after soft landing for our economy.
It was surprising to see how strong consumer spending was in the first half of the year. It defied all predictions. But the Canadian Chamber's Business Data Lab has been tracking consumer spending and its intentions, and have found that after June, as a result of higher interest rates, that consumers were pulling back and the consumer spending was softening as a consequence. This was the intention of the Bank of Canada, obviously, and it appears to be having that effect. And one would expect then we'll see this as we continue through the year.
Yes, and that is exactly our thought. When we think about the first half of the year, we had such robust job growth, almost 300,000 jobs created, which is staggering. Now, we did see the unemployment rate move up, but that was because we had so many new entrants into Canada. So our population growth outpaced even that 300,000 job creation. So our unemployment rate is up about 0.5 percentage point compared to its recent low, but it's still, for Canada, at historically low levels of 5.4%. So I think that was, underpinning all of that spending we saw. We also know that there's lots of savings. Now, only on some balance sheets, not right across the entire population. And we've also, it was interesting, a lot more borrowing on credit cards by Canadians in the first half of this year. So this too, I think, it grew very robustly in Q1, still strong in Q2, but I think we're quite likely to start to see some of that level off. And so all to the point of what the data lab is showing us, it does seem likely that things are going to soften just enough, I think, that we'll see this consumer pull back.
Can we set this in an international context? How do the policies of the Bank of Canada compare with that of the Fed in the United States or other banks? In early August, the Bank of England raised interest rates again by a 1/4 point, and we've seen other central banks around the world doing the same thing. Has the Bank of Canada been more aggressive or less aggressive than other central banks?
Well, at the top end of the range, I guess I'd say, but not the US, the UK have been more, I think it's the Reserve Bank of Australia. They've been more aggressive than the Bank of Canada. Now, we're talking between 10 and 25 basis points, so it's not material, really. But having moved rates, we're in keeping, I think, with most of our global peers, all of which are sort of, I think, facing the same circumstances as we are. We look at the US, growth in the first half of this year averaged 2.2%. Now, you wouldn't really think that if you're thinking about an environment where interest rates have moved up so significantly. So we're all sort of facing all of these, I guess I would say, unexpected strength in the economy or resilience in the economy, even though interest rates have moved up.
Let's talk for a minute about theory here. If inflation is seen as a bad thing, something that's dangerous that banks have to intervene against, and you mentioned the one tool they have is interest rates to deal with that, What about deflation? The obvious intuitive response would be if inflation's bad, then deflation is a good thing. People can afford more. Yet Japan, for so many years, suffered from deflation, and they were desperately trying to reverse that.
Mhm.
There's talk now that China may be sliding into a period of deflation as well. What is more dangerous, inflation or deflation? What are the impacts of deflation?
Well, certainly deflation, when we think about it, I mean, why would prices be falling? It's because you have a lack of demand or oversupply. So you have a situation where things are out of balance, whether inflation, where it's too much demand, or deflation, where there's not enough demand. So they're both very damaging, I would say, to the economy if they move too far out of the range. And as you've said, we think about Japan and how people talk about the lost decades, that they just weren't getting anywhere in terms of economic activity, economic growth, expansion. So, they're both damaging in different ways, but, I think what our experience, of course, in Canada has tended to be where we've had low inflation, but we haven't had deflation. And some of those periods of time have been great in terms of economic activity, economic growth. So it is kind of, how do you get, as a central bank, get to that sweet spot where you have just enough inflation, just enough demand to, encourage businesses to expand. Now, I think for Canada, that is one of the issues. And that is the fact that we have seen as much investment by businesses as other countries. And we look at that, it shows up in our productivity numbers. I was looking back at a report that Deloitte wrote. It's called Catalyst, toward a thriving Canadian economy in 2030. And they really looked at all of these issues, showing, our productivity performance against this huge list of countries, and we're way near the bottom. And then they looked at, business investment relative to the size of our economy. And it's pretty interesting. It's about between 10 and 11%. Now, we did have a period between the great financial crisis and 2014 when oil prices fell, where in fact our investment activity had picked up so much. It was 13-14% of GDP. So that was looking very good. Of course, we know that that was mainly in the energy sector, but we've since come back to that 10.7% as of the first quarter of this year. And so these are the challenges, I think, for Canada, is how do we get our investment numbers up? Because that will improve our productivity, it will help corporate profits, it will help wages, and improve overall standards of living. And so I think when we're thinking about our economy, not just over the next 6 months, not over the next 18 months, but when we think about it over the next several years, that has been a challenge. And I think it is one of those ones that's really top of mind for Canadians and especially for Canadian businesses.
Can we pursue that point for a bit? There's been report after report after report suggesting that Canadian productivity is poor, that when you look at real growth per capita, falling behind. We track GDP growth, but most of that has come from immigration as opposed to improved productivity. The government of Canada itself has acknowledged the fact that we have a productivity problem. We've known about this for years. The problem appears to be getting worse, but we aren't correcting it. What do we need to do to fix the problem?
I think there are just so many things that we've talked about over the years, the perennial interprovincial trade barriers. Why are they not, wiped out? And Deloitte did a report on that within recent years, and showing that the loss, the opportunity loss, I guess, in terms of our GDP, should we have been able to eliminate that? It's the things that we look at, and we look at it from the global environment. The World Bank, they have this study on the ease of doing business, and I think recently Canada's improved a bit, but they looked at things like building permits, and it just took so long compared to other major economies to get projects going. So as a business, I can only imagine the frustration and really the discouragement. You have this wonderful idea, you've set up your financing and you're waiting for approval. So I think these are the types of things that we need to consider. Just one data point, being a bit of a data geek, I looked at the CD Howe study, and they were looking at sort of investment dollars per worker and comparing Canada and the US. And that report showed that for each dollar a US company puts in per worker, Canada's 53 cents. So, I mean, it's not all that much of a stretch to go, maybe we have a problem. But as you're saying, how do we put the right incentives in, make it easier for Canadian businesses really to invest and get those numbers a little bit more even so we can reap those productivity benefits. Now, we have had some recent data come out from Statistics Canada, and they're looking at things like research and development. And they did show that, on that front, we did see some good gains in the period between 2016 and 2021. Then some growth is projected for 2023. 2022, I think, was 3.5%, 2.5%. So, seeing some money being spent, that's all good. Where is it being spent? Clean tech, new digital platforms. So these are the things that we have to continue to be really leaning into, I think, especially when we think about everything we're reading on generative AI. And, we really have to get our best foot forward, I think, in terms of that for us to improve our productivity.
Can we talk about business investment for a minute? It's been a long-standing problem that we've known about for years, that business in Canada, relative to its peers in other countries, underinvests in its own workers and upgrading skills. It underinvests in technology in terms of bringing in new machinery and equipment that will make the workforce more productive, and it underinvests in ideas and R&D. I think our temptation is to say, why doesn't the government do something about this? But is it a matter of a lack of government policy, or is there a structural problem here that causes Canadian businesses to invest less? For example, the branch plant nature of Canada's economy. Does that mean that the parent company is far more likely to do R&D closer to head office than it is in a branch plant, or to invest in upgrading the skills of workers closer to head office, or to invest in machinery and equipment closer to head office than in branch plants? And are there other factors here that affect that as well that we need to address?
And I mean, we're a vast country, and it's true. We have our own made in Canada companies, and it is certainly the case that we have to ensure that these are the ones that are investing and expanding and commercializing. I think that's another thing that people often point to, that Canadian companies come up with these fantastic products, but it's getting them into the market and getting them paid. And so I was reading another study, and they were talking about the fact that, perhaps marketing and sales should be something else Canadian companies should be doing. Not just saying, okay, let's do it in Canada, absolutely, but let's export it. Let's reap some of the rewards that are due to Canadians, because once the money comes back in, again, it just perpetuates this investment cycle and gets us creating even more. So I think those are some of those main issues. It is embracing it, and it's hard to create that culture. But I think as you said, we've been speaking about this, I don't know, I've been doing this a while, and it's always been the case that it's like, how do we do it? How do we do it? And certainly the challenges continue to exist. We are seeing Canadian companies adopt certainly all kinds of new technologies. And it is also, I think, keeping on that forefront of that, adopting these, making sure, as you said, the skills are appropriate, that we help our workers move up so that they can quite easily adapt to what's coming next, because it seems like we have lots of disruption coming at us in the near future.
You used the word culture, and can we take a look at that for a second? It's often said that Canada's business community is more conservative or more risk averse than our counterparts, particularly to the south in the United States. Is there data to show that, or is this simply anecdotal? Are Canadians less likely to take a chance to invest, to risk new ventures that they might be going into, such as going into a foreign market, which they don't know well?
I mean, there are surveys, and I don't, off the top of my head, recall what the even who conducted it. I think there are surveys that show that, but that's not an end all and be all, and it's not something we can't change. I think certainly, Canadians, and especially as our population grows, we're bringing in a diversity of ideas, diversity of skills, all of those things, I think, gives us what we need to move up in terms of just changing the way we look at the world, the way we look at, our exporting. I mean, we are a great exporting country. We know that. That's goods. Only our exports, only about 20% of them are on the services side. So, working towards increasing that, more diversified, I think can also be a real trigger, and will get Canadian companies, commercializing and selling to the rest of the world.
And such a high percentage of our exports are commodities that are
Mhm.
unprocessed here in Canada, which have been moved to higher stage of production.
Right.
So this requires obviously government policy. It requires cultural change. It requires the desire on the part of business, really a recognition of the fact that the world's our oyster if we're prepared to go out and to seize it.
Exactly.
Looking down the road, what do you see as for the prospects for the Canadian economy in the next, say, 5 years? Do you see us addressing these problems successfully, or do you see them continuing to grow?
Well, I think when we look at the economy, I mean, one of our challenges that we've talked a lot about, of course, has been the demographic challenge. The fact that we have so many people retiring, and now that's being addressed through immigration, trying to get that average age of our population, or the median age, something where we can support our old age dependency, or just our dependency ratio with the young and the older Canadians. So I think certainly that does brighten the outlook in terms of addressing that issue. But we also have to set up people for success. And so I think, over 5 years, we need to know that we are giving people the right skills, that we are giving them places to live, because you can invite a lot of people to come, but if you don't have that infrastructure in place, it's just very difficult. And I think the risk is that we end up having people who come to Canada excited, go, oh my goodness, this is really, really, not exactly what I thought it was going to be. You're challenged anyway, but have to face challenges, whether it's, where you're living, the type of job you can get to, commute times, etc. So, I am optimistic that we can rise to these challenges. Globally, the fact that people are becoming, I don't know if it's deglobalization, but certainly I think we are a trusted partner for the world in terms of trade. So as you said, the world's a bit of our oyster because we are sort of a stable, solid country. And I think that really puts us in good shape to expand what we're selling and who we're selling it to.
That's an encouraging, optimistic view. That's certainly good to hear. Let me see if I can drag you a little bit further out onto a limb here. It's often said that that predicting is a dangerous thing to do, particularly if it's about the future. It's particularly dangerous if it's about the near future, because people are apt to remember. Speculate for us, if you will. Will we see more Bank of Canada rate increases this year?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think that, what's in the pipeline right now is this slowing in economic activity. And I think it's going to be sufficient to convince the Bank of Canada that, 5% is fine. It's adequate to do the job, to dampen some of this excess demand in the economy. I also think that, when we look at all of the spending we're seeing on services, that is, it's kind of people getting it out of their system, I think, in the post-pandemic. Real life is coming back. People are going back to work. They're going to be spending their budgets differently, I think. Not all people will be able to continue to work remotely. Some, so you're going to see some of those expenses coming back on. As well, I do think that we'll start to see some easing up on some of these service prices. And so from the Bank of Canada's point of view, that's key. If we see service sector inflation rates start to ease off, that's going to allow them to maintain that policy rate at 5%.
The R word. Will we be able to dodge a recession?
Well, we have a very modest, as I said, recession. I mean, it's like 1/10 of a percentage point negative in the second half of this year. So it's really zero growth. So I think the potential is definitely there that we won't see such a significant decline in our economy as we've seen through other periods. Now, of course, this really reflects a view that we don't see any huge interruptions in any of our biggest trading partners, and in particular, the United States. We had that scare in March when Silicon Valley Bank, there were banks that were things are happening. Rates are really causing disruptions in the financial system. But that was managed, I would say, pretty well. And so as long as we don't run into any of these types of elements where it's beyond our control and not necessarily in our country, but has disruptive impacts on the financial system, for example, or has a significant impact on confidence, that's when I think the risk of recession raises its head again. But at the current moment, our forecast is, as I say, for negligible growth in the second half of the year, and starting to see improvement in 2024, because if this view is correct and inflation looks like it's heading sustainably towards that 2%, the Bank of Canada could be in position to actually lower the policy rate next year.
Final question, the dollar. Obviously the dollar and interest rates are closely connected.
Yeah.
The Fed has been quite aggressive in terms of its raising of interest rates. What do you predict for the dollar between now and the end of the year?
Well, if we're correct on our forecast, we think that there is scope for the currency to do a little better in 2024, because the likely scenario we would see would be where the bank's going to be a little slower in terms of the lowering rates than the U.S. Federal Reserve, so that moves in Canada's favor, and we see a bit of a pickup in the Canadian dollar. Of course, oil prices are also very important for our currency. And so we don't have a big movement in the price of oil. So that kind of just keeps it on a really steady tilt. So I would say, if we're at close to 75 cents today, we have it moving 78, 80 cents as we go through 2024.
Don, we've covered an enormous amount of territory in a very short period of time. And you have a great facility for being able to take these difficult concepts and make them accessible for ordinary people to understand. Thank you so much for being with us today, and thank you for the leadership you're providing and the advice that you provide for the Canadian business community as well. It's of enormous assistance to all of us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Look forward to having you back.